which is called Part 1, Animal Abuse and Domestic Violence. And I want to thank you for taking time to be with us for the next hour or so. We are very pleased to have been able to schedule this training webinar in October as a resource on domestic violence, since October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Now, the webinar is part 1 of our 3-part webinar series, What Judges Need to Know About Animal Cruelty Issues in Family Law Cases. And this webinar series has been created through a unique partnership project that NCJFCJ has with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the partnership. Oh, thank you. That is exactly where I wanted to be. In October 2018, the National Council entered into a partnership with the Animal Legal Defense Fund to provide juvenile and family court judges with training and resources to be able to better respond to court cases that involve animal cruelty issues. And we're so proud to be able to say this is the first formal partnership between a judicial organization and an animal protection organization. And then in July 2019, the National Council approved a resolution. And you can see on your screen here to the very left a little bit about that's the beginning of the resolution. And it's a resolution regarding animal cruelty and its links to other forms of violence. And as part of that resolution, NCJFCJ committed to providing training to juvenile and family court judges on the link between animal cruelty and interpersonal violence. In July 2019, the National Council also released a technical assistance bulletin for judges on animal cruelty issues. And the cover of that technical assistance bulletin is on your far right. Animal cruelty issues, what juvenile and family court judges need to know. And both of these items will be in the Google Drive that Elisha mentioned you'll all have access to. And we'll be talking about these resources during the session as well. In August 2020, we offered a 2-part webinar series on animal cruelty and what juvenile and family court judges need to know. And one of those webinars was on animal cruelty and child abuse, and the other was on animal cruelty and juvenile offending. And for today's training, and they've all been involved with the National Council's Animal Abuse Initiative since our partnership began in 2018. The Honorable John Romero Jr. is the presiding judge of the 2nd Judicial District Court, Children's Court Division in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Judge Romero is also the past president of the National Council. And then we all have Diane Balkin, is a contract attorney for the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Criminal Justice Program. And Diane worked as a prosecutor for many years for the Denver District Attorney's Office. And she had served as the animal crimes prosecutor for that office. And then lastly, we have Kathleen Wood. She is a staff attorney with the Animal Legal Defense Fund as well. We're hoping to save a little time for questions at the end of the presentation, but if questions come to you during the presentation, please write them in the chat and I'll be paying attention to them, okay? Yes, you will have access to the slides for the PowerPoint presentation in a PDF. They'll be part of the resources on the Google Drive. I'd like to turn our program over to today's speaker. Judge Romero will do the official welcome.
Thank you, Martha. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We all involved in this presentation, and I'm sure many of you have pets in your household. Luna and Ruby are the current occupants of our household who allow my wife and me to live there. They're the ones that call the shots. And I could, like most of us who have pets, could talk about them forever, but I will resist the temptation. During the presentation today, we're going to explore whether there is a connection between harm to animals and harm to people. Most of you know the answer to that already, but we're going to get deeper into the weeds on that. And just because there are pets in the household and there may be other parts of violence going on in the household, are they at risk if they're in that violent household? And as judges and other court professionals involved in domestic violence cases or in any other kind of case we may be in court for, should we be aware of whether there are animals in the household? Are the human vulnerable persons the only ones that are vulnerable? Are the other furry persons, and I put it in quotes, but some folks would say they're persons too, are they at risk? The next slide, Diane, please. We're going to do another poll, as I recall. Just trying to find out, of those of you who responded and are present in the session today, what is your role? What category best describes you? If you would take some time to answer that, and then Elisha will post the results here momentarily. Child welfare, juvenile justice professionals, I'm a bit in awe that we have no one from that category, but we can talk more about that later. Thank you. Diane, the next slide, please. Martha already mentioned that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and you can see by the banner at the very top that it's significant to all of us. We should be mindful of the fact, however, that domestic violence occurs likely every hour, every day, every month of the year, and it's serious business. It's been ongoing for time out of mind, and we've been addressing this issue in the courts and in advocacy for many, many years, and we're still learning more and more about what we can do and cannot do. Certainly the involvement of animals as victims, as vulnerable household members in domestic violence is part of what we'll be talking about today. I would be remiss if I didn't say a little bit about Penny, who is pictured. She's Kathleen's Penny is the one who tells Kathleen what to do. She was quite frankly very involved in the planning process for this series, and Penny is not shy about making her presence known.
She'll probably make an appearance during this webinar as well, knowing her.
So after this session, we will all have a better understanding of the link between animal cruelty and domestic violence. We're also going to take a look at what not just judges, but what all court professionals can do on and off the bench, in and out of the courtroom, to make families safer. And families, of course, includes the other vulnerable members of our households, our pets. We've already talked a little bit about the resources that are available, and you're going to have a listing of what those are as we move on through the presentation. So very quickly, a few interesting points that I've seen multiple times. The first time I ever saw these, I was a little bit shocked. The fact that the majority of American families have pets in their households was not shocking. Our own adult children, other friends and family members, we know they have pets. That wasn't particularly shocking to me. What was interesting is that a young person in the United States is more likely to be attached to and grow up with a pet in their household than those of us of the male persuasion, a stay-at-home father. That's rather sad. Pets do good things for us. They're companions. They make us feel less fearful. They actually make us feel important because we need, especially if you have a cat, you need to serve them and they need you, and it's good to feel needed. When we used to have dogs, when our kids were young, exercising that dog was a very important part of our day. And after they left the household, that fell to yours truly, which I can certainly use all the exercise I can get. Pets also are very important to the children in the household. Most of us grew up, I certainly grew up with two sisters, and it was a love-hate relationship. But with pets, siblings or kids in the household very often view their pets as much more important than their mom and dad, and most of the time have greater feelings for their pets than they do for their own siblings. And the last bullet point is a crucial one, I think. And I can't sum it up in any other way than pets are unconditional in their affection and their love for us. And most kids view their pets that way. Next slide, please.
Kathleen?
So I'm just going to be interjecting here and there to ask our panelists some questions. So first of all, I want to turn things over to Diane Balkin and ask her what we know about the link between animal cruelty, interpersonal violence, and crime generally.
Thank you, Kathleen. We have learned through multiple areas of research that violence is violence, and violence under one roof is inextricably interwoven. So it is not uncommon for us to see more than one form of domestic violence under one roof, including domestic violence, spousal or intimate partner abuse, child abuse, elder abuse, animal cruelty. And we also could probably include a fifth circle in this Venn diagram to include crime, because we know that often animal abusers are engaged in other criminal conduct. The research also tells us that it's often many government agencies that respond to the same address, so we need to cross-report, be aware of what each other's tasks are, and to educate each of the various professional groups and organizations to handle violence. What is clear is that when animals are abused, people are at risk, and when people are abused, animals are at risk. I always stress that it's important to be aware of this link because it's a matter of public safety and human welfare. It is also a matter of animal welfare, but I really stress the fact that we need to be aware that violence is violence, and one of the key roles a judge or anyone in the community safety be aware of this link to make sure that we don't minimize the significance of cruelty to an animal. The days of saying it's just a dog or just a cat or boys will be boys are over. It's really important in crime prevention because if we come across someone proactively or reactively that's engaged in criminal conduct involving animals, we need to intervene quickly and provide that person with evaluation and treatment to prevent him or her from engaging in criminal conduct in the future. And we used to think that there was a graduation theory that if someone was abusive to an animal, they would go on to be abusive towards humans. But what we now know is that there simply is a correlation between the two, and there's no particular order in which it occurs. It's also significant in breaking the cycle of family violence, because as we will learn later in this presentation, a significant number of victims of domestic violence will not leave the home, the abusive household, for fear of what might happen to their pets. So if we are aware of this, we can provide them the tools to help them break the cycle of family violence, because as the judge alluded to, the bond between a child and an animal and an adult and an animal is so strong that it often motivates them in a way that they would rather remain in the situation than extricate themselves.
And I would just interject to say, in addition to the correlation, committing crimes against animals in the presence of someone else can in itself be a form of violence or abuse towards that person. So there can be a direct overlap as well.
Yeah, we have learned that children who merely witness violence become desensitized to violence and engage in that conduct themselves. We are often asked why a child would be violent towards an animal, and there is a concept called pecking order battering. Just go back to that. Pecking order battering, where a husband or wife beats the spouse beats the child beats the pet. So we need to be very aware, and I believe, Kathleen, don't some states have sentence enhancements for animal cruelty committed in the presence of children?
Yeah, just a couple of them, about 4, do have sentence enhancements.
Thank you. Also, it's important to note that finally the FBI on a national level, think about it, they're engaged in the ultimate in crime prevention and detection and investigation. In 2016, they added reporting of animal cruelty to their NIBRS database. NIBRS is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. The only problem with NIBRS is it's voluntary. Not all law enforcement agencies submit data to NIBRS, but it is a start to try to gather data on animal crimes, and they've separated it into 4 different categories. So this made the news back in 2016, and we've downloaded some of the significant statistics from their studies from 2018. 97% of animal crime incidents concern crimes of neglect and animal cruelty. 68% occur in the home, which is very noteworthy since we are really centered on domestic violence. And the most common crimes in the home associated with animal cruelty and neglect are simple assault, aggravated assault, weapons violations, and intimidation. So if you just take a quick look at these statistics, it looks like serious assault cases are of the greatest percentage. So we need to recognize the importance of all of this. One study showed that animal abusers are 5 times more likely than non-animal abusers to commit violent crimes, 4 times more likely to commit property crimes, 3 times more likely to have drug or disorderly conduct offenses. And how this translates to the community, law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, child welfare, animal welfare, is that if somebody's engaged in an act of animal neglect or animal cruelty, the odds are that they are engaged in some other type of conduct in your community that we need to address. When we specifically look at the link to domestic violence, we want to know what exactly is this connection and what does it show us? Well, one study showed that 89% of women that experienced domestic violence reported that their partner threatened, harmed, or killed their companion animal. What's important about this is these types of studies show us how important it is when police investigate domestic violence to simply add a few questions to the victim saying, has your partner threatened, harmed, or killed any of your pets? If so, when, how, what happened? This helps us get a better idea on what's going on in that household and what we need to address. And likewise, we need to have child welfare workers look to see if animals are being harmed, and domestic violence counselors to ask about children and animals and the elders. So we need to really be aware of how this plays out in the family. Over half of women victims of domestic violence delayed escape from their abusive partner out of fear for their animals, and we briefly touched on that before. And as we know, when we deal with domestic violence, the greatest risk of harm to the victim leaving the violent situation is when they leave. And they also probably have experienced a pattern of abuse, whether it's emotional or physical, against themselves, their children, their elders, or their pets, which causes them greater concern about what might happen if they depart. The bond to a companion animal can be used to manipulate, intimidate, and control partners and children. Think about how persuasive it would be if the abuser says to the victim, if you leave me, I will kill Fluffy. If you don't come home right away, I'm going to slit Fluffy's throat. Or often we will see abusers who sexually abuse children say, if you tell your mother what happened, I will hurt Fluffy. The other thing we know is that batterers who also abuse pets are more dangerous than batterers who do not abuse pets. They use more controlling behavior, more forms of violence, and this would include marital rape, stalking, and other forms of violence. Kathleen?
Yeah, so as Diane was saying, harm to an animal can in itself be a form of domestic violence. So now we want to look at which states actually include animal cruelty in those definitions. So you can see on the map that those states in blue actually have animal cruelty listed in their definitions of domestic violence, meaning that there doesn't actually have to be a threat or harm to the person themselves. It's sufficient that a threat or harm was made to their companion animal in an attempt to intimidate or control that person. And then you can see in the kind of pinkish color, those are states that include animal cruelty in their definitions of stalking, and the federal law does include that as well. And in Arizona and Texas, they have both the animal cruelty included in their definitions of domestic violence and stalking. And then I have Oregon in its own color because it doesn't actually include domestic violence in its definition of, or animal cruelty in its definition of domestic violence, but it does have a statute that explicitly recognizes the link between animal cruelty and domestic violence, and it includes animal cruelty in its definition of coercion.
As Martha indicated, I am from Denver, Colorado, and Colorado is extraordinarily progressive with legislative efforts that involve protecting animals and humans. This is a picture of my dog Maverick with his favorite stuffed toy, his little stuffed husky, and he is often seen in my presentations because he's so handsome. In Colorado, we are very blessed to have included animals in our definition of domestic violence. And part of the reason I share the language with you is that if you come from a state where it's not distinctly included in your definition, I think it would be appropriate in certain circumstances for you to perhaps use the language and recognize this if a case presents itself where the threat or abuse of an animal is an integral part of a domestic violence case. So it's defined as an act or threatened act of violence upon a person with whom the actor is or has been involved in an intimate relationship. It also includes any other crime against a person or against property, including an animal, or any municipal ordinance violation against a person, against property, including an animal, when used as a method of coercion, control, punishment, intimidation, or revenge directed against a person with whom the actor is or has been involved in an intimate relation. And what's really important about this, it goes hand in glove with our statutes we'll talk about later that includes pets and protection orders. It's a great way to try to be proactive to prevent future violence by recognizing the significance of harm or threatened harm to an animal in the context of domestic violence. Kathleen?
So now I want to ask Judge Romero if he can share what situations might a juvenile or family court judge see involving domestic violence and animal cruelty, or what kind of DV cases might indirectly or directly involve pet welfare.
Thank you. I think the answer to that question has to do with what questions we ask. We cannot assume that going about our daily business in the cases we typically hear, that there may be pets in the household that we should be concerned about. So the kind of case that I see in children's court, in our juvenile court, and it happens infrequently, is a juvenile who may be charged with animal cruelty. As Diane already made reference to, just because that child is charged with animal cruelty, should we be asking the question, what's going on in the household, and is this child a victim of abuse herself or himself? But zooming out a little bit, in every case that we have, we should be asking about whether there are pets in the household where there is an allegation of domestic violence taking place. There are any number of cases like child welfare cases where, at least in my jurisdiction, we get advance affidavit, like a probable cause statement, where we have some indication that there may be pets in the household. We should ask about those and ask about, has that pet been taken care of appropriately? In a domestic violence household, has that pet been harmed? What is the relationship between that pet and the humans in that household, particularly a child? That pet may be the one source of comfort, not just for the abused adult, but certainly for the child.
One thing I would add is that Randy Lockwood had a great expression. He would say that often the abusive individual will come home, he or she, and they are bent on violence and they don't bother to count the legs on the victim. So it could be a human or an animal.
That's right.
Kathleen?
Good point.
Yeah. Kathleen?
So this is something that's on all of our minds, especially the fact that we're doing this via webinar instead of in person. So the effects of COVID-19, what impact has that had on domestic violence and animal cruelty?
Well, the next couple of slides will go into that a little bit. I want to acknowledge my NCJFCJ judicial colleague, Carol Kelly, who is exposed to this issue in the context of domestic violence in her court much more than I am. However, we all experience the fact that in whatever state we happen to be in, depending on the transmission rate, and certainly early on, stay-at-home orders, shelter in place, were things that we were supposed to be complying with. For the batterer who's already manipulative and exercising power and control, that's a heaven sent, increased isolation of those family members. Unfortunately, many households are also experiencing economic hardships because of job loss. They're being evicted from their apartment or their home, and increased economic hardships necessarily equals increased risk to the family members, particularly if there's an abuser already in that household. And that includes not just the human victims, but the animal victims as well. In child abuse and neglect, we know that that's being reported as occurring more frequently now than before. But what's scary is how much is going on that isn't being reported. In the age of virtual classrooms, kids getting telecounseling, or kids going to their doctor's appointments via telemedicine instead of appearing in person. The bottom line is critical reporters of violence in the household are offline, and they're not providing that information to us because the kids aren't available to them. The other vulnerable folks are not available to them. Even veterinarians who typically would see an animal in person in their office oftentimes talk to the owner of the dog or the cat over the phone and don't actually see the animal to evaluate the extent of what harm that animal may be experiencing, or the other members of that household. Ostensibly, the vet is looking at the animal, but can they ask the question, everyone else safe in the household? And if not, address that. We've already stated several times that our furry family members, our pets, serve as a source of love and security, because all human beings in the COVID-19 era are under greater stress. Even my 6-year-old grandson, who's fed up with classroom via computer and wants to interact with his friends, he's under a bit of stress. When that happens, pets may be threatened. They may be harmed, or that abuser in the household, the batterer, has another opportunity to manipulate and control the human victims by threatening, hurting, and even killing the pets. With the arena of elder abuse, pets might be neglected because that elder doesn't have the financial means to keep supporting them. That doesn't apply just to elders, it applies to all of us who may be experiencing economic hardship and the stress that I've already talked about. It's not hard to think of, police officers, firefighters, and others who may come into contact with a household under egregious circumstances, risking their life protecting a pet. But it's not unusual, according to our son, the firefighter, that when they show up at a scene, the owner of the home wants to go back in the home to get their cat or their dog, even though the house is crumbling around them. And humans may risk their lives in protecting their pets. That's what the relationship between humans and animals can be.
Kathleen?
And as promised, Penny has made her debut. So Judge Romero, what is the role of judges and legal professionals when it comes to protecting domestic violence victims and their pets?
In speaking about Colorado law, Diane talked about their provision that actually allows judges to issue orders of protections that include the other vulnerable victims, the furry four-legged ones. In my own jurisdiction, while I don't believe it's actually part of our statute, I can't think of a single judge who does domestic violence cases who will not include animals in their orders of protection, including who they're going to be with. If one of the victims doesn't have the financial resources to provide food for that animal, judges can order the abuser to pay an increased amount of support on an interim basis so that there's sufficient funding to be able to take care of that dog, whether it's placing the dog in a dog shelter or buying food for them or whatever, or taking them to the vet, whatever may be necessary. You know, what judges can do is what we typically do, is ask questions. Lawyers ask questions as well. Social workers, probation officers should be asking questions. But knowing what to ask, who to ask, and when to ask those questions. Simple things like, do you have a pet in the house? Tell me about your pet. Who takes care of the pet? What kind of food does your cat or dog like? When was the last time you got to see your pet? Those kinds of things that are somewhat benign, but may lead to other things that alert a judicial officer or other court professionals to respond accordingly, and out of court ask those kinds of questions. There's going to be a little discussion later on about shelters where pets and the human victims can reside together, along with shelters for pets by themselves. Again, I've already touched on the last bullet point. When we ask questions, you know, understanding and appreciating the relationships between the human victims and the pets. Just very briefly, in one of my cases, and I think some of you heard me tell this before, in a child welfare case, the teenage young lady who was now in foster care was not particularly eager to spend family time with her mom or dad. There were no siblings in the household, but what she was adamant about wanting is to be able to see her dog and see if the dog was okay, and maybe asking the foster parents if the dog could move in with her into the foster home. A huge clue of how important that dog was to this young lady and her difficult strait. Next slide, please.
Kathleen?
I want to talk a little bit about what judges need to know about statutory provisions that give the court authority to protect human and animal victims in domestic violence cases. So as you can see from this map, there are about 2/3 of the states explicitly permit judges to include animals in protection orders. About half of those states do limit it to pets or companion animals, but you can see that you know, the vast majority of states do have these provisions. And even if your state doesn't have a statute that explicitly permits pets to be included, it's likely that the statute is broad enough that the judge would still be able to adapt the order to include a companion animal. I also want to point out that the Pet and Women's Safety Act that was just passed a couple years ago does allow for interstate enforcement of protection orders that include companion animals.
As a sample, because I don't know where the audience is from, this is Colorado's criminal protection order. We also have a civil protection order. Although I dated it 2018, it's because it was expanded. It was actually enacted years ago. And it's upon the court's own motion or on the motion of the DA, there can be a motion for the protection of a victim or witness in cases involving domestic violence, and the court can enter an order prohibiting the taking, transferring, concealing, harming, disposing of, or threatening to harm an animal owned, possessed, leased, kept, or held by an alleged victim or witness. And I think it's important to note that we broadened this to include witnesses in cases to recognize the significance of a threat against a key witness by implying that someone would hurt their animal. It also specifically applies to animals of children, whether they are the victim or the witness. And in Colorado, we are lucky. Animal includes any living dumb creature, so it would include large animals and farmed animals if the otherwise fit within the domestic violence definition. And the civil protection order is even broader, and part of the reason I include this language is to let you use this language in a discretionary manner, even if you don't have a specific law allowing for it. So in civil cases, the court can restrain a party from molesting, injuring, killing, taking, transferring, encumbering, concealing, disposing of, or threatening to harm an animal owned, possessed, leased, kept, or held by any other party or a minor child of any party. And the court can specify arrangements for possession and care of an animal. So this is really an important leap that now the court can start talking about who gets to take custody of the animal. And as Judge Romero indicated, it's important to look at the role an animal plays in a household. And this is a darling picture of Rue, who is Martha Ellen Blomquist's cat. Kathleen?
So turning back to Judge Romero, what can judges do to safeguard family members and pets that they are attached to? Should a judge take into consideration a family or child's attachment to a household pet when devising a safety plan in domestic violence cases?
Kathleen, certainly in response to the first question, Diane very thoroughly covered that in reviewing the Colorado statute. And even if our own jurisdiction may not have such a statute, doesn't mean that a judge can't order that. Doesn't mean that animal safety advocates can't advocate in a legislative sort of setting to have that included in the statute so that there's no doubt. Obviously, in any orders we issue in cases involving family law, human safety is always a consideration. Since we know that so many families, households in our country have pets as part of their family, not just as animals in the house, but as family members, we should always take into consideration not just the safety of the two-legged vulnerable folks, but also the four-legged variety as well. The batterer should not be left out of the equation. Often that batterer is not a kind person, but he is a member of the family as well, or she, if the batterer happens to be female. But evaluations, assessments, and considerations for treatment of that individual so that the family can be made whole again in a safe way. In my neck of the woods with child welfare and neglect and abuse, and certainly in domestic violence and other family law cases, separating a child from their family members is traumatizing by itself. However, there is some literature that suggests that separating an animal from a child or the other adult in the household that they have a connection to is traumatizing for the child and for the adult who is involved. Next slide, please. And just quickly about the previous slide, you don't need to go back to it, but on the bench, I don't want to limit that to judges. All court professionals who happen to be involved in cases have a role to play. Don't leave it up to the judge to do it himself or herself. Suggest to that judge that he or she call a meeting about this very issue. And I would venture to guess that a number of folks will show up, and you can take the lead as the other court professional in discussing the issue and what might be a plan of action for making things better. Back to off the bench, please. So that kind of goes with what I was just finishing with, that a lot of folks, judges, lawyers, all of those who are involved in the court process don't necessarily have an awareness of what the link is that we've been talking about in these webinars. Educate others, talk to others about the link. Some of you asked about whether this PowerPoint would be available for you to take a look at. Plagiarize it, make your own PowerPoint presentation and present to folks in your community, present to organizations in your community, even to law enforcement who may or may not have had the training in it, but others. Educate. It's not okay to sit on our hands and say, woe is me, but let's do something about it to make others aware of what's going on. When resources are not available in the community, look to this PowerPoint slide in the resource list and see what you can do to get information from those resources and technical assistance to establish those resources in your own community. Next slide, please.
So speaking of resources, we want to look now at what are the community resources to help safeguard humans and pets that are at risk of harm. So right now I want to do a quick poll and see, do you know if your community has a domestic violence shelter that allows pets to be housed along with the survivors? So I think Elijah should be issuing a pop-up. And give people enough time to answer that really quick. All right, looks like, oh, almost 2/3 of you do say yes, your community does have a shelter that allows companion animals. And 17% say no, and then 21% say they do not know.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. I'm going to take a moment now to talk about community-based sheltering for human and animal victims. It is so actually heartwarming that 2/3 of you are in communities that offer this type of housing, because we are really moving towards this as a future response and answer to extricating people from violent situations. And it's a way to address the fact that many people are afraid to leave their homes where violence is taking place for fear of harm to their children or animals. One of the greatest, well, these are kind of a list of some of the leading links to learn more about co-sheltering. One is Allie Phillips' Sheltering Animals and Families Together. It's called the Safety Program. And Allie does extraordinary work one-on-one with communities, from converting a garage to having indoor kennel space to outdoor kennel space. She has learned how to address issues with children who are fearful of animals or allergic to animals. So there's really nothing we can't overcome to try to create a shelter that can house victims and their pets. Red Rover is a wonderful source for finding funding to create these types of shelters, and they work far and wide throughout the country. And the Animal Welfare Institute is a great location to go to find out if there is a safe haven, which is a term coined by Frank Ascione, safe havens, whether there is a facility near you. Kathleen?
So now we want to talk a little bit about what national resources are available to you to look at these kinds of issues. So first of all, the Animal Legal Defense Fund publishes each year our annual rankings report. And this assesses the relative strengths and weaknesses of each state's animal protection laws. You can see the 2019 report there. So each January we'll actually publish a report that reflects the legislative updates from the previous year. So our 2020 report will be coming out in January of 2021.
This is Diane. I have to give a shout out to Kathleen. This is her project, and she nearly single-handedly is responsible for it. It's an extraordinary amount of work, and it's updated all the time. It's very easy to navigate. It's interactive. You can click on the state, and just tell them a little bit about what the color coding means.
Yeah, so you can see in the map there, the red states are the bottom tier, which means they have the weakest animal protection laws. Yellow is middle tier, and green is the top tier of animal protection laws. And if you go to the report, you can click on the state and see individual strengths and weaknesses in the laws. You can download our compendium, which contains all animal protection laws for the state, and those are organized by category, and one of those categories is protection orders. So that's an easy way to just check and see what exactly is your state statute regarding animals and protection orders.
Thanks, Kathleen. Probably the best single resource in my experience is the National Link Coalition website. And by the way, all of the links to all of these items we have referenced is in the handout that Elisha put in the chat. So you'll be provided with a link to access these. The National Link Coalition is unbelievable. Phil Arco puts out a link letter every month, and he includes within it any cases that are link related in any state or territory, or some even noteworthy that are international. He includes any efforts in legislative changes. He is a great resource, and he's great at organizing things. One resource he has that is just unbelievable is, I wasn't able to capture it on the screenshot, but he also has an interactive map that you can click on for people that want to know where to report animal abuse, neglect, or cruelty. If you don't know where to report it, he has downloaded the contact information for thousands of law enforcement agencies, shelters, police stations about where to report animal cruelty, and it's hugely valuable. And you can see on the left what the resources are, the questions, and anything you want to know, one-stop shopping for link information. Another great resource is the Colorado Link Project. It is kind of housed with the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work because they have a great study on the human-animal connection. And it has very valuable resources, in particular, which we're not going to talk about today. I don't know if you can see, it has a drop-down that says assessment and intervention. They list all of the assessment tools available to clinicians to evaluate and treat animal abusers. It's got professional toolkits for various occupations. And of course, you can also contact the Colorado Link Project, but it particularly has very valuable resources for judges to use to evaluate an animal cruelty crime, to look at really the risk and considering things like the degree of intent, whether there's prolonged suffering, and so forth. From the National Link Coalition, you can link on a word called Bibliography, and this is also put together by Phil Arco, and this is over 800 scholarly and mainstream publications you can access about the link, and he has separated them out by category. So if you want to get some authoritative information on this, it's another great resource.
I want to thank our speakers, Diane, Kathleen, and Judge Romero, for their time and expertise. As you can tell, they're very knowledgeable individuals, and that we appreciate their time being involved in this series. I wanted to let you know that we actually will have our next webinar on November 2nd. If you aren't already signed up for that, I would invite you to consider. That webinar will be on animal abuse and elder abuse, and we'll be joined by Judge Rosa Figueroa for that webinar. I would like to ask you to take a moment to complete the survey that Elisha will be sending to you, so we can get your feedback on this webinar and also other ideas that you might have for future webinars in this field. I recognize them to contact any of them if you have specific questions that you think they could help you with. This technical assistance work and training is ongoing, and so we look forward to continuing to contribute to the field, which needs training and knowledge in this area. And so do stay tuned to the National Council to see what else we're offering down the road. So I think with that, we can conclude. Thank you again, everyone, for your time in participating, and to our faculty